A frequent question that people have about native or indigenous people is that very problem. What do you call people who are indigenous or who have ancestry among the first people who lived on this continent or any continent? Usually, the most accepted terminology is more specific than any of these general terms. Usually, people like to be called by their particular nation or tribe's name: Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, whatever it might be. But if we're going to generally call all of these people by one term, what do we use? In this video, we'll talk about the pros and cons of different terms. First, let's go with the most contentious one: Indian. What are the pros and cons of using the term Indian when referring to indigenous peoples? Most would rightfully identify it as a fairly out-of-date term, but there are some people who prefer to be called Indian over anything else. The term Indian is first and foremost a very historically grounded term. The term Indian has been used in legal, political, and cultural contexts for centuries, especially in the US and Canada. It appears in many official documents, treaties, and legal terms, like the Indian Act in Canada or the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the US. And some indigenous people have reclaimed the term, using it within their communities and in cultural expressions. Some indigenous groups have thus embraced Indian as part of their identity, using it in a way that honors their heritage and challenges colonial narratives. For example, powwows and other cultural events might use the term in a context that fosters a sense of community and pride. For a lot of non-indigenous people, the term Indian is also immediately recognizable and may help them understand the context of the historical or legal discussion. The cons. The number one con is that the term Indian is a misnomer. It originates from Christopher Columbus's mistaken belief that he had reached India when he landed in the Americas. This mislabeling is geographically inaccurate and perpetuates a colonial misunderstanding of indigenous peoples and their diverse cultures. Indian is also thus seen as a colonial term imposed by European settlers, which can carry negative connotations of oppression and erasure of indigenous identities. It can be offensive to some indigenous people who prefer terms that more accurately reflect their unique cultures and histories. Finally, the term Indian fails to recognize the diversity among indigenous peoples, grouping them under a single label that overlooks the vast range of languages, cultures, and histories among different tribes and nations. This generalization can lead to stereotypes and a lack of appreciation for the distinct identities of various indigenous groups. Of course, this problem of lack of specificity is also true for the next two terms we're going to look at: native and indigenous. So let's talk about the word native. The term native is widely recognized and understood to refer to the original inhabitants of a particular region. In the US, for instance, Native American is commonly used to describe the indigenous peoples of the country, making it a familiar term in both public and governmental contexts. Native emphasizes the connection of indigenous people to their ancestral lands, highlighting their status as the original inhabitants. This can help assert their historical and cultural ties to the land, in contrast to the settlers and immigrants who arrived later. Many indigenous people prefer native because it's seen as a term of respect that acknowledges their heritage and connection to the communities. It also gets used in various linguistic formulations or contexts, like Native American or Native Hawaiian, allowing for a degree of cultural and regional specificity. Of course, it still fails to be completely specific. It does not encompass, it encompasses too many cultures and languages and histories to tell you much more other than a kind of broad grouping. The term native can be ambiguous because it can be used in other contexts as well, to refer to anybody who is born in a particular place. For example, a native New Yorker, a native Californian. This dual usage can sometimes cause confusion when it is used without additional context. While native is widely accepted, it is not without its controversies. Some argue that it still frames indigenous peoples in terms of their relationship to the land, which can reinforce colonial perspectives. Additionally, not everyone prefers this term, opting for more specific identifiers. And then finally, the term indigenous. The term indigenous is widely recognized and used in international contexts, including by the United Nations, to refer to the original inhabitants of the land. It very commonly applies not only to indigenous peoples in the Americas, those people that we might call native or Indian, but also to those in Africa, Asia, Australia, and other parts of the world, making it a universally understood term. Indigenous, like native, is seen as a respectful and inclusive term that acknowledges the original inhabitants' rights and cultural heritage. It avoids the cultural connotations associated with terms like Indian and places emphasis on the people's connection to their ancestral lands. The term indigenous often also carries with it an emphasis on sovereignty, self-determination, and the rights of these peoples to maintain and develop their cultural heritage and political autonomy. It aligns with the language used in legal and human rights contexts to advocate for the protection of indigenous rights. Indigenous is precise in its language, clearly distinguishing the original inhabitants of a land from later settlers or colonizers, and avoiding many of the terms much of the ambiguity that exists with native, with native New Yorker or something. The problems with indigeneity are, first off, that there's a kind of perceived formality. Some people might find the term indigenous too formal, scientific, academic, anthropological for everyday conversation. It's often associated with these academic discourses, which may make it seem less approachable in casual contexts. While indigenous is widely used in certain circles, it may be less familiar to the general public, especially in regions where other terms are more commonly used. And like the other terms, it can be seen as a broad label that might overlook the specificity of different indigenous groups. We hope you've enjoyed this video. Please subscribe.